Let's get into it. I want to just preface this with, if you have not worked with Node.js before, if you are not familiar with JavaScript, this is probably going to be a bit intense. So just a friendly warning for those of you that might not have as much JavaScript experience that just kind of want to learn a little bit about the lay of the land. This will probably be a bit more advanced, but we're going to start with the very basics for what you can do with these tools. I'll be using the OpenAI API, which is probably the most common one, but if you wanted to build this using Anthropic or something different, you totally could. So my goal here is not to build something from scratch, but instead to kind of show you some code, walk you through what things are doing. For those of you that have never worked with a tool like Node.js, I will definitely do my best to kind of help you get up to speed with it in a reasonable time frame. But I do welcome any questions on chat that you want to throw out there. So if you do have any questions, please do raise your hand or throw them in the Zoom chat, especially as we start talking about code and walking through individual things. If there is anything in particular you're looking to dig into or things you want to play around with a little bit more, definitely welcome that as well. So feel free to throw any thoughts you have in chat as we kind of go through things for the next 45 minutes or so. So what we're going to be building in our first application is a small little interview prep quizzer. So you are looking to prepare for Rithm School and you just want someone to ask you a bunch of random questions about JavaScript. So you're all here to learn about AI with JavaScript, but let's make sure we know our JavaScript. What does the index of method do? Feel free to throw that in the chat. You came here thinking I would just talk, but no. What does the index of method in JavaScript do? Well, we can't answer this. We're in trouble for the next 45 minutes. I know someone can help me here. You can throw it in the chat, shout it out. The questions do get harder, so please feel free. All right, what's it do? Searches an array and returns the index. Yes, so finds an index of first thing found, otherwise -1. We do correct, cool. All right, what does the pop method do? Don't worry, we're only going to do a couple more of these, and I'm going to show you how to build this thing. But if you're looking at this and you're like, oh, I'm not totally sure, this is a really, really nice tool. Yeah, it removes an element from the array, but which one? So if I just say removes element from array, my AI is very forgiving. So it's probably going to say, yeah, you're correct, but it really should tell me it removes the last one. What's the difference between null and undefined? Not sure. Okay, well, the answer is not sure is actually going to be marked as correct because null is a mention of not knowing something. If you access something using an object and you're incorrect, you'll get an incorrect. And you see here, it's very primitive. There's lots of additional features we could add here, but this is essentially just me talking to an AI and an AI actually talking to itself a little bit. So as we talk about how to build this application, this is a very small interface that we are building just using the OpenAI API. There is tons of additional features and functionality and things we can add. There's, more to this code that we can do, but I'm just going to quit for now, close this, and I'll just show you what this is doing. This is about 90 lines of code. But this is 90 lines of code that involves understanding a bit of JavaScript. So we're going to have to make sure that we are comfortable with some ideas in JavaScript, and I will do my best to go through them and give you a little bit of a start for how to work with these particular tools. So what are we doing here? Welcome, everyone. We are video on and interactive, as you've seen from me asking you random quiz questions. So if you have the bandwidth to turn your video on, it's always more fun to just talk to faces as we go ahead and learn about these particular topics. So for those of you that do have your video on, thank you. And for the familiar faces, it is very nice to see you again. So what are we going to be doing? We're going to build apps using large language models and AI APIs. Let's just get a little bit of terminology out here. These large language models are essentially AIs trained on lots and lots and lots of language and have the ability to converse with us, have a back and forth conversation, answer questions, ask us questions, and so on. What's an API? Many different pieces of terminology that you will get, but I'll give you a very, very broad definition. It's data and functionality that is made available to you. So all that an API is it's a bunch of data or a bunch of functionality made available to you. You might use the Spotify API. You might use the OpenAI API. what we are using the OpenAI API for is to use some of the models that it has and some of the functionality of those models. So when we say OpenAI API, we basically mean I want to go and use one of these models. I'm not going to run this model on my computer. This is not an open source model. This is something that I am paying a very, 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 very small amount of money for. That's how OpenAI works. There are lots of other models that you can use that you don't have to pay for, but you have to run them on your computer. And depending on your computer's hardware, that's not always possible. So that's why you're going to see with getting up to speed on some of these things, so much of this is done with OpenAI. When you get more comfortable, when you get more knowledgeable, and you want to run your own models, you're using some open source model or Llama or whatever it may be, you can totally do that. But that's obviously going to be limited by the hardware that your machine has to run that model and so on. So that's what we're going to be doing here. Again, we're going to build something relatively simple. But for those of you first that don't know me, my name is Ellie, one of the founders and lead instructors here at Rithm School. When I'm not writing JavaScript or Python, I teach quite a bit. So currently leading instruction in one of the cohorts. And if you have any questions, it's my name at Rithm School. You can chat with us on the website or the Slack channel as you come join us. So feel free to reach out with any questions as you have this stuff as we go through. Let's dig into it. A little bit about you. Ideally, an adventurous new coder or just an adventurous coder. You could be new or not new. It's not really that important. It's more that you're just adventurous. What do you know? If you have never seen an async function before, this is going to be a bit tricky. If you have never seen promises before, this is going to be a bit tricky. If you have never heard of node.js, this is going to be a bit tricky. Not impossible by any means, but there's some stuff that's probably going to be over your head. And that is just the nature of the beast. This is not something that you should be learning if you are just learning your JavaScript fundamentals, because you're just not there yet. And that's fine. You will definitely get there at some point, but you just want to be reasonable with your learning. If you don't really know how to drive a car, you're not going to step into a Ferrari and start driving. So take your time as you go through these kinds of things. Alrighty. What are we going to build? Well, if you're interested in attending Rithm, or if you're just jonesing for some JavaScript trivia, we are going to be building a small application like we saw that is going to quiz us on some fundamentals of JavaScript. So here is our lovely quiz application. It's going to ask us questions like, what does the pop method do in JavaScript? Removes the last element of an array. And that's great. What else to do? What's the difference between null and undefined? We'll type some gibberish here. Oh, that's incorrect. All right, cool. What's the purpose of using keys? To access a value. Cool. What does the split method do? The split method turns a string into an array. Cool. All right. When accessing an object, what's the difference between dot notation and bracket notation? Help me, please. Oh, we can get those answers as we want them. And we can quit whenever we want. I'm using the terminal to interface with this particular application. So I am using an environment for running JavaScript called node.js. This does not work out of the box with JavaScript in the browser because there is sensitive information that you need to store when working with these tools. So you cannot, if you are used to writing JavaScript in the browser, making an HTML file and a script tag and so on, you can't do this right out of the box. You have to run your JavaScript in a slightly different environment. The environment that I'm using is called Node.js. Node.js is a program that you install either from the Node.js website, or you can Google around for other ways to do so. But Node is a way for me to run a JavaScript file. It's a way for me to just run some JavaScript. So the same JavaScript that you might be used to in the browser, I am now running on a server. The server happens to be my local computer right now, but this is simply just a different place to run JavaScript. So if you're used to the browser, that's fine. That's where it all started. Node.js is how you can do it in the terminal. And I'm going to walk through some of the tools that we're using to make this all happen. So we'll discuss how to build this as well as another more complex application towards the end. In order to build this thing, what do we need? Well, we need a data source for our topics. When you're building any kind of application that is using any kind of AI, then you're going to need some data. And you can use the AI as your source of data but the AI is limited to what it has been trained on. Fortunately, in our case, the AI has been trained on the basics of JavaScript, so this is not something that we have to teach the AI, but we do have to tell the AI what we want to get from it. If you are building some other application, the second one, if we have some time that I'll talk about, is a chatbot to interact with Rithm. So you have questions about Rithm and you want to ask it, what is the tuition at Rithm School? To the best of my knowledge, ChatGPT 3.5 has not been trained on all the inner workings of Rithm School. So we have to feed to that large language model the data that we want. Depending on what you're trying to do, you will either use existing data that the LLM knows about, and that's always the easiest, or you will have to feed data to the LLM so that it can become knowledgeable about any new information. There are many different ways to do this. This is often called fine-tuning or augmentation retrieval. So you'll see a lot of kind of fancy terminology for that. But when you work with these kinds of tools, the first fork in the road is, do you know what I'm talking about or do you not? In this case, it does know what I'm talking about. So that's a little bit easier. We'll make a list of topics. We'll tell it what to do. We then need some kind of large language model to feed prompts and generate responses. And there are many different companies doing this. Some are paid, some are open source. OpenAI is by far the biggest one, and that's what we'll be using. You could use Claude, you could use Gemini, you could use, many different tools. OpenAI and GPT 3.5 is what we're going to be using because it's relatively easy and very inexpensive. The next thing we need to do is we need to collect some user input. So if you remember from this little application that we have here, we need some way of collecting the input that the user has. So when I run this program, I need to collect what the user is typing. So how do I get this? When the user types, we need to collect that. And to do so, we are going to use a built-in tool to Node to help us out. So here are going to be the things that we need to build this particular application. A data source for our topics. We're going to tell the quiz application what things we want to be quizzed on. And then here is where we're going to be using a lot of external tooling. Here's where we're going to be using some things that Node comes built in with. A little bit on OpenAI. Here's your very generic paragraph about what it lets you do. Powerful AI models, including the renowned GPT series. They're capable of understanding things, and you can use these tools for many different things. I would imagine if you are coming to a meetup like this, you have heard of something like GPT or used it, particularly ChatGPT, which is the public chat interface that OpenAI has. So I would assume that you have kind of come across this company and the tooling that we have at our disposal. So what are we going to do here? Get started with this thing. To start using the API, you got to do a couple things. You have to give them a credit card because they may charge you. They may not. Usually you get some free credits when you start and so on. When you sign up for OpenAI, you can choose either ChatGPT, which is, I'm not doing anything programmatic. I'm just talking to the large language model, or you can use their API. When you use their API, you can see all sorts of things that you can do with the API. These are all things that you can do programmatically. We'll talk a little bit about embeddings. Spoke a little bit about this idea of fine-tuning, so kind of giving the model a little bit more, tweaking some of the things that the model does to make it work in an image that you want. If you want to do text-to-speech, speech-to-text, image generation, model generation, etc. Talk a little bit about assistance as well later on. So you can do quite a bit here. They've got a nice set of tutorials for working with all different kinds of things. They've got a nice little quick start as well. And then there are lots of different models that it has, depending on what you want to do. We are going to be using GPT 3.5 Turbo because it is less expensive than GPT-4, and it's going to do more than enough for what we need. If you're dealing with images, you may have seen of DALL-E. If you're dealing with audio and such, you may have seen Whisper. You may have kind of been on the latest cusp of things and know that OpenAI is currently in private mode with video generation around prompts as well. So there's a lot more kind of coming here. You can dig into these models if you'd like a little bit more. You can see kind of all the information that it has, particularly the training data. So if you find yourself needing to work with something that was trained a little more recently, you will probably want to use something that is a little bit more modern. Different models have different capabilities. There are lots of different ones here. I would not worry about getting too overwhelmed. We're just going to pick GPT-3.5 Turbo, which is more than enough for us. In order to use the API, OpenAI needs a way to uniquely identify you. And that is what these API keys are for. An API key is what you use. You give this a name. I can call this, first app. And this right here, well, once I begin the puzzle and prove that I'm human, this will give me a piece of information that uniquely identifies me and the application that I'm building. This is very sensitive information. If someone accesses this, they can use the OpenAI API as you. So this is not something you want to share with your friends. This is not something you want to put in a place where people could find it publicly. Again, this is why you learn the fundamentals of JavaScript and you build some web things first before you start worrying about secret keys and so on. But a reason why you can't do this all in the browser is because this information cannot live in the browser. This is sensitive information that we don't want people to have access to. You want to copy and paste this and store it somewhere. Once I see this, I can't go back and see it now. So this is not something I'm going to be using. But I just want to show you when you make your secret key, this is what you use to actually interact with the API. This secret key is something that in your code, you can absolutely put in directly. You can absolutely go ahead and do this right here, and your code will work. You don't ever want to do that, though, because if you put this code on GitHub, if you share this code with anybody, they can take this and just run free with it. If someone gets access to this, they have access to your billing also. So if you gave me your secret key for OpenAPI, I can rack up charges very, very, very quickly on your credit card, and that one's on you. So you got to be really, really, really careful with this secret key that they give you. None of this will work without a secret key. So what do we do? Where do we store this? Well, very commonly, we make a file to store our secret keys. That file is very commonly called .env. This is a file that we will ignore when we are pushing this to GitHub so that it's not public information. This is something that just lives on my computer and not something that other people can access. If you are not familiar with this idea of environment variables and so on, don't bother learning the AI stuff. You got to kind of eat your vegetables first. So you can look at all the tutorials and stuff, but if you write some code and you don't really understand this idea of environment variables and security and such, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. So all we are doing here is simply, instead of copying this particular value here, which is sensitive information, we are going to use a library called .env. And when we include this line of code, we can access that secret variable right here. We do that using process.env. This is how we access our secret keys. So the value of this thing right here is that string that you saw in this file that no one can access. That is just on my computer. So if I put this code on GitHub, if I shared this code with you, this is all you would see. You yourself would have to get your own key, make your own .env file, and put that in there. So what I'm doing here is essentially, in order to work with the OpenAI API, I need to give it a unique identifier for who I am, my application, my credit card, my account. If you do not have this, nothing is going to work. So you have to make sure before you use OpenAPI that you go ahead and make a key. Sign up for an account, visit the website. Once your account is set up, go to the API section, get your key. Your key is essential for making any kind of request and working correctly. To make your life easier in JavaScript to work with the OpenAI API, there is a library you install using the Node Package Manager. That's what NPM is. Again, if you have not worked with Node or have not seen NPM and so on, this is going to be a bit over your head, and that's okay. This is not something you're going to start building your, first week of JavaScript. So if you're learning JavaScript seriously and you're looking at this and you're like, I understand 20% of it, that's okay. We're using node.js. We're in a different runtime. This is how we go ahead and install things. We do that using npm. There are lots of other ways of installing this. This is just the most common. So you grab your key, you install OpenAI, and once you've installed it, you can import it. You can import it using the require keyword, or if you are a little bit more on the bleeding edge and familiar with a different module system, you can also do this as well. Import OpenAI from OpenAI. So if you want to use the newer ES 2015 module system, you can totally do that too. I'm using the slightly older node syntax because that's what you will see a bit more commonly still. So I'm going to bring in the OpenAI library. I'm also going to bring in a library called readline. Readline is a library that allows me to read user input and send back user output. So we got a little bit of work to do to get set up. You can follow these steps, and we'll share some handouts for these as well if you want to kind of go back and revisit it. Go to the website, get an API key, install, and get going. Once you get that API key, I want to show you very briefly how this API works. In fact, I'm just going to take this small script and I'm going to run it on its own. I'm going to go back to my text editor, and I'm just going to open this up in Node. I'm just going to run Node. Go ahead and make this a little smaller. I'm going to go ahead and bring in my environment variables. And you will see actually when I call this, it tells me, here's what you have. Here is your secret key. I can now access that process env OpenAI API key. That's my secret key. So once I've done this, I've brought in that sensitive information. I'm now going to bring in the OpenAI library, and I'll go ahead and make this OpenAI variable, which represents all the things I can do with the OpenAI API. So this right here is a way for me to interact with the OpenAI API. I have a function here called generate text. Yes, that is true. If I'm using Node.js 20, the .env is not required. There are a couple flags I need to pass in to make that work, but yes, that is true. This generate text function is going to try to do something. And if an error happens, it's going to console.log. We are going to go to the OpenAI API, and we're going to chat with it. We're going to ask what model we should use. We're going to use GPT-3.5 Turbo. And then we're going to send it some messages, essentially like a chat history of sort. We're going to pretend that we are a user, and we are going to give it some content based on whatever we pass to this function. We are going to get back a response from the LLM. So I'm going to go ahead, put in this little function right here. I'm going to call generate text. And I'm going to pass in some conversation and some text to ask the LLM. What is OpenAI? We're going to see here we get back a promise here. We get back some future value. That's what this function returns. But when this is done talking to the LLM, we get back this nice little paragraph. And it's going to tell us all about OpenAI and what it does and yada, yada, yada. This is very similar to you talking to ChatGPT. This is not exactly what happens, but it's very similar functionality. We're figuring out what model. We are taking the role of a user. We are passing in some kind of prompt. And we are seeing what the response is that we get back from the LLM. What is the weather in San Francisco right now? Things that you can't do with an LLM out of the box. It would be impossible for this that was trained up until 2021 to tell me what the weather is right now. So LLMs can't do everything. you're like, oh my God, this is the future, it's going to take my job and so on. Not yet. Probably not for a while. So we still got plenty of time. This can't do everything. This also might not know many things that are more recent. Who founded Rithm School? Well, the good news is it's 50% correct. Matt Lane was one of the founders. Martin Galsby, I have no idea who that is. For those of you that are familiar with large language models, this is what's called a hallucination. This is where the LLM is extremely confident that it knows the answer, but it's completely wrong. This is another challenge with large language models, where it thinks it knows the answer. It's a very different world that we're entering. We're used to a world where we search on Google and we don't find what we're looking for. And we go on with our day. This is kind of the opposite, where you ask it something, and instead of it saying, I don't know, it says, I know with a lot of confidence this is the answer, but the answer is completely wrong. So when you work with LLMs, it's a whole different kind of beast. This is also why if you're learning how to code, don't copy and paste everything ChatGPT gives you. So that is definitely something to think about. The other piece that we have here is we have no memory of that conversation. So if I say, generate text, what is 2 plus 2? 2 plus 2 equals 4. If I then say, now add 2 more, it's going to say, now we add 2 more to the total count. Again, extremely confident, a very, very strong, confident response, but that has nothing to do with what I was previously talking about. We'll talk a little bit later on about memory and how you can work with an LLM to have a chat history so the chat remembers, oh, in the context of what you were talking about, well, then obviously adding 2 more is now going to be 6. But right now we are programmatically achieving similar functionality to what you do when you work with ChatGPT. We specify what the prompt is. The prompt is dynamic. That's the parameter to this function. Here I'm just saying explain machine learning, but you could pass in anything. And if something goes wrong, it tells us. This is kind of your meat and potatoes for working with the basics for a large language model. As you can see, there are some things that work and there are some things that don't work. For the application that we want to build, we're going to be using this idea. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to import the libraries we need. So what are we doing here? Import the libraries that we need. We're also going to set up readline, where we basically say, what is the input we collect? We collect what comes in what's called standard in, what the user types, and the output is standard out. We're printing to the terminal. If you were collecting input from a different place or you wanted to output it to a different place, maybe I want to put that in a text file, or maybe I want to put that in a text for an email, or I want to save that to a CSV or Excel spreadsheet or whatever, you can do that here. But right now, we're just kind of setting things up. Bring in the libraries that I need, allow for me to collect user input, and set up my connection to the OpenAI API. So we're doing these first 10 lines of code. Next thing we're going to do, generate a data structure for our topics. Here's where you can think about what data structure might be interesting for all of your topics. There are many different ways of doing this. I made an object, and each object has a key, which is the topic, and it has a value, which is an array of the things that I want to get asked about. If you wanted this to be a set, you totally could. If you wanted this to be an array of arrays, you totally could. I just happen to use this data structure because it works with what I need to do. So I got these topics. If I wanted to get asked about other things, maybe functions, sure. Ask me questions about functions. I would go ahead and add that. This has nothing to do with OpenAI and so on. These next 2 functions, this is just good old JavaScript. So if you're looking at this and you're not totally sure what's going on, great. You know where you're at with your JavaScript learning. That's fine. Take your time with these pieces before you worry about all the things that LLMs can do. Again, you can make this whatever you want it to be. I felt like an object where I have some descriptions for what I'm doing. So if I ever wanted a direct topic, I could do topics.functions. And I could go ahead and I could get all of those. I can mutate it. This seemed to me like a reasonable data structure for the task I have at hand. I don't care about ordering. Doesn't matter which order these come in, but I want some description for them. So here's the data structure I made. Here's what I'm going to work with. I'm then going to generate a random topic. I'm going to pick a random topic. There's nothing terribly crazy about what I'm doing here. I'm just picking a random topic. So I'm turning this into an array so that I can pick a random one. And then from that array, I'm picking a random one. So pick a random category, and then from that category, pick a random topic. This can work with any kind of data structure. I just say by default, use the topics. This could live somewhere else. This could be tested somewhere else. This could be using a database. This doesn't really matter. This is just some JavaScript here to pick a random one and then pick a random one. A good function for you to write. Test your understanding of arrays and objects, dot notation, bracket notation. Does what I need it to do. Nothing with the LLM yet. But that's the first 25 or so lines of code. So nothing too crazy that we're getting into yet. Again, any questions, feel free to throw that in chat. Happy to talk about those pieces. There are tools that I will show you in a second that make a lot of this easier. We're going to talk a little bit about LangChain and what it can do in the ecosystem, but you can do a lot just with the OpenAI API out of the box. So a good place to start, just to kind of get your feet wet. I'm going to generate a question and an answer. I need the LLM to do that for me. I need the LLM to take something like includes and generate a question for me. That could be, what does includes do? How do you use includes? What does includes return? I want the LLM to figure that out for me. I don't want to write the question, and I don't want to write the answer. So that's all I'm doing here. Question here, do you wonder about scale when creating these topics? Can you have thousands and thousands without other concerns? Yeah. There's nothing terribly complex about this particular data structure. And if I were to have thousands or hundreds of thousands or fetch us from a database, that would be totally reasonable. So this could scale pretty nicely. So here's what I do. I have a function here called generate question and answer. Instead of me pretending to be the user, I am going to tell the LLM, here's what I want you to do. This is called a system prompt. If you've used ChatGPT and you're looking to do something, you might have found yourself doing something like, I am a writer looking to write a book about cats. And then you give it a prompt. This is called a system prompt. This is kind of like warming up the machine. Instead of just saying, tell me what includes do, what it does, sorry, I'm going to say, create a JavaScript quiz question and an answer about whatever the topic is. Keep it short. Don't include code snippets. This should strictly be a text-based question and answer. So all I'm doing here is simply telling the LLM what I want the question to be. Because if I don't give it this detail, it's going to spit out, 30, 40 lines of code and say, where is includes being used or something that I don't want to read. This is called a system prompt. So what do? Feed it to the model. The temperature is basically how creative do you want the LLM to be? The lower this number, the higher chance it may say it doesn't know what it's doing. The higher this number, the more it might hallucinate. So we're sticking with something relatively easy here. Max tokens is basically how much of an output is it giving me? The higher amount of tokens that you have, the more output, the more you're going to get from the LLM, the more you're going to pay. In this case, I'm paying, pennies upon pennies upon pennies to make this happen. So this is a very reasonable number here. What I get back from this is a very large object. What I get back from this object is a property called choices. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you this right here. I'm going to console.log the response that I get back from the LLM. And then we can dig into this data structure that I have here. So I'll go ahead, run my little script again. And here we go. This is the response. The question is, what is a callback function in JavaScript? But right here, this is the response that I got from the LLM when I said create a quiz question and its answer and so on. It gave me just one option under choices. And inside there, it gave me a message. That's the thing that I want to dig into. So programmatically, this is where working with objects and arrays is helpful. Response dot choices at index 0 dot message. That's what I'm going to access, this sub object right here. This is the response. I want to dig into this object. I want to access this property, which is an array. I want to access the first thing in the array, which is an object and its property called message. So just arrays and objects and digging in. That's why we hammer this stuff home. All right, go see what this gives me. There we go. This is the response. Inside of this response object, I have a property called content. This is the output of the LLM. The role that I'm getting is an assistant. This is what the LLM gives me out of the box when I prompt it for something. The LLM is acting as an assistant. And the content that it gives me is this text right here, question, and then answer. What I'm doing here is what one would call relatively janky. This is where I probably would use a library or something more fancy to parse this text and make it look nicer. What I'm doing is I'm taking this right here and I'm splitting it by a new line character. That way I'm turning this into an array, and the first thing I get is this thing, and the second thing I get is this thing. Is that super reliable? No. Does it work for a one-off demo in 45 minutes? Yes. Are there tools in the LangChain ecosystem that will split this and make it look pretty for me? Absolutely. So all I'm doing here is I'm taking this and turning it into an array, and I'm storing the question, which is this text right here, as the first thing. The second thing in the array at index 1 is this new line character, which I'm ignoring. And then the third thing is the answer right here. So this function generates the question and answer, and it returns an object with those properties. I'll just go ahead, console.log those for you to see. So just so you can get a sense of what this function is doing, it's going to return an object with a key of question and a key of answer. And that's what I get right here. Very commonly, what you find yourself doing with these LLMs is taking this and turning it into something right here. This kind of parsing of an output. And depending what your output looks like, depending how complicated it is, parsing that output can be a pain. Very commonly, we use tools in the AI ecosystem to do this for us. I just have a very, very simple way of doing that right now. How can you split a string into an array? Use the split method. We're now going to have to figure out how to take this and how to evaluate it as correct or incorrect. Well, my model is very forgiving. My model hallucinates. I probably would turn the temperature down to make sure that when I put in taco, it does not mark that as correct. This is where you get to play around with things and see what works and what doesn't work. What's the purpose of a while loop? No idea. Help me. All right, that's incorrect. Here's what it does. And each time that I'm doing that, I'm generating a new question and a new answer. So the first thing I'm going to do is generate the question and the answer. Then I have to accept the user input and ask the LLM if it is correct. So I'm actually going to be using OpenAI twice. OpenAI twice, sorry. One, to have it generate a question and an answer for me. And then two, to determine if what the user typed is correct. And here I'm going to do that again with a function called evaluate answer. It's going to take in some user answer and then some correct answer. The correct answer has already been generated. The correct answer has already been generated by the LLM when I asked it for the question and the answer. So we're going to give it a new prompt. Here is where it's a little bit of an art form. You can tweak this. You can mark the temperature up a little bit. You can change the prompt to try to make it a little bit more accurate. I'm being very forgiving here. Given the correct answer is this, what the user is comparing against, evaluate the user answer. If the user's answer is correct, is it correct or incorrect? Even if it's not complete or partially correct, mark it as correct. This is where I'm being very, very friendly and forgiving. Be sure to provide a clear and concise evaluation. Don't require necessary context to fully explain usage. Detailed answers can still be correct. Do not require a full explanation. Give me a short response to evaluate the user's answer. It should be correct or incorrect. So I'm basically telling the LLM how to grade. And then what am I doing? Exactly what I did before. So this is a very, very similar function to what I had above, except it takes in some user's input, and it takes in some correct answer. This is just a function to tell me, is it correct or not? I could build this quiz just by asking myself questions over and over again and seeing the answer, but I want to know if I'm right or wrong. That can make it more fun and gamified and so on. What do we have next? Collecting some user input. I'm going to use the readline module and say, here's the question with a new line, and then what is your answer? I'm going to collect it. If they put in quit, then I will go ahead and quit, and I will close everything. Otherwise, I will add a new line, and I will take the user's answer and return it. When you write functions, try to make your functions just do one thing. What is the purpose of this function right here? Just to evaluate the answer. What's the purpose of this function? Just to give me the question and the answer. Could I combine this all into one gigantic function? Of course. But what's really nice about this is I can put these all together right now. Here's the main function. Here's what kicks it off. Pick a random topic. Give me a question and an answer. Collect the user input. Evaluate the answer. Show me what the evaluation is. Show me what the correct answer is. And here, nice little bit of recursion. Run it again. Start the program. Call this function. Pick a topic. Generate a question and answer. Collect the user input. Tell me if the answer is right or wrong. And console.log what I get back. In this case, the evaluation, which is either correct or incorrect, and then the correct answer. That's the bare bones of what this does. We'll send this out. You can take a look at it. You can play around with it and so on. This is a very small application that just uses the basic idea that we saw before of talking to an LLM. Are you a user, or are you feeding the LLM with some kind of seed data of sort so it can work with you a little bit more easily? But a lot of it just lies in this functionality here. So this is what we need to do. Ask the LLM if the answer is correct, display the correct results to the user. That's what we're seeing. What do you want to make sure you're comfortable with before you tackle this stuff? Just your fundamentals. We've got objects, we've got arrays, we're picking random numbers, we've got a tiny bit of recursion. Later on, you could do a loop of while true or so on, call it again. So we don't have to do that. That's just an easy way to make this run over and over and over again. You got template strings, function calls, splitting, collecting values at certain places. So all these kind of ideas in the fundamentals that you just do over and over and over again, this is why. That's why you think a lot about just good function design, putting pieces together. That's what you're seeing over and over again. Question here, when grading the response, you have the max token set to 10. Would that affect the amount of context that the LLM has given the length of your prompt? Potentially. That definitely will make it a little bit on the shorter side. If I give this essentially more tokens, it's possible that the answer is going to be a lot more long-winded. So it's a little bit of playing around to kind of find the right spot there in particular. But yes, that would definitely alter things for sure if I played around with that more. And that kind of leads to the next point there. What else can we do with this thing? Well, for starters, just, take a look at it. And then what can we do? We can keep track of correct information, incorrect information. We have a setting to modify the difficulty. The good news is this is also just your fundamentals. Keeping track of correct and incorrect information, well, each time that we run this program, we could have some kind of responses. Or better yet, we could have, results. And here we have a score. And your score is 0. And then we have your, correct answers. And then we have, something like your, things to study. And then as we go ahead, we tell the LLM to update this, or maybe my functions are now a little bit smarter where I can take in some kind of, results. And now when I generate the question and answer, I can see where in the results do I need more practice and so on. You've got infinite flexibility for what you want to do with this thing. But it goes back to the fundamentals, the data structures, functions, and so on. It's really where you can kind of get your feet wet. Other things that you can look at in the ecosystem, other things we can do with these LLMs, well, we can fine tune them. We want to feed or augment these existing models. You can take a look in the OpenAI documentation for fine tuning. You can go ahead and create jobs to feed models too. You can specify what data you want to send, what training data, what validation data, what seed data, how much you want to pass things in, and so on. You can do all sorts of that manually, or you can do it programmatically. So if there's additional data you want to feed to the LLM, you want to teach it new things, you want to get it to respond in certain ways and get trained to respond in certain ways, you can do that. You want to have multiple step tools with LLMs. You want LLMs to do a bunch of different things. So instead of just telling me, how's it going, I can ask it to do something like, go to Google and find the name of a coding school and find me who started it and find me what they teach. It can do multi-step processes. Those are often called agents. You can also give your LLMs functions. So you can tell your LLM, when I ask you what the weather is, I want you to go to the weather API, fetch this data, get me that data, turn it into Celsius, give it to me, and tell me how hot it's going to be, or what, how heavy a jacket I should wear. So this idea of kind of instructing the LLM to call functions, that is something that is relatively newer with OpenAI that you can do. Some tools in the ecosystem you may come across. When you have text that you want to train an LLM on, when you have text that you want to feed, you want to give the LLM all the information about an existing web page and so on, we have to convert that into a data format that large language models work with. And those are often called embeddings. And embeddings are a way for us to turn text into things that models know, like numbers. You can take a look from the API perspective, how to get those. There are all sorts of models and obtaining them and so on. There's a little bit of sample code and so on. OpenAI has a really nice piece here for what embeddings are. If you want to dig a little bit into it, it's actually quite nice. You take this right here and you turn it into this. If you're looking at this and you're like, oh, vectors, oh man, I haven't seen vectors since Calc 2, or vectors were this thing that were hard that someone once spoke about. It's an array of numbers. It's an array of arrays of numbers. It's an array of arrays of arrays of arrays of numbers. Essentially some multi-dimensional array that contains a bunch of numbers. Those numbers are plotted on a certain dimensional grid. That could be 2 dimensions, that could be a million dimensions. And what you see is we figure out the similarities between some of these. So there's some really nice pieces here. You can drag in, you can kind of play around with what these embeddings look like, and you can see that this right here is some information about a Turkish fencer that's pretty close to other athletics, but very far away from a steam turbine cargo vessel operated in 1887 to 1908. So your text essentially gets turned into a data structure like this that gets plotted like this. And that's how your LLM figures out similarity between things. Something all the way over here is a village in Argentina. Something all the way out here is a Bollywood thriller. And you can see these are quite far away and how those are picked. You do not need to worry about things like cosine similarity and dot products of embeddings and so on. If you want to, look into the math behind it, you're welcome to. But OpenAI does a really, really nice job kind of giving a easy to digest idea around embeddings. OpenAI also gives you functionality to just turn text into embeddings. When you create all of these wonderful embeddings, you need to store them somewhere. So we'll talk a little bit about some data stores for that. And then when you work with LLMs, you either use its data or you need to feed it some data. To store embeddings, we often use what's called a vector store. A vector store is simply just a database that can store embeddings, that can store these arrays of arrays of arrays of arrays. If you've worked with databases before, if you work with Postgres, Postgres can store vectors. If you've ever done something like full text search with Postgres, that's called a TS vector. These are things that exist already. You may come across companies like Pinecone. These are very, very popular software companies that let you do the storing themselves. Supabase is another one. But this has been stuff that's been around for a while, this idea of storing vectors. We're just using it for this idea of embeddings so that we can train our LLMs and have it remember stuff that we've said. So you might come across this term vector stores, vector databases. This is where you store stuff that you want your language model to remember. As you start to see all of these things, agents and embeddings and finding text and storing text, you can do that with OpenAI and a lot of other tools. But what you will very, very commonly see is a tool called LangChain. I have here kind of the quick start for working with LangChain, but LangChain essentially is a tool for putting together all of these ideas in the AI ecosystem. You want to use an LLM like OpenAI. You want to retrieve data from a web page. You want to split that data more intelligently. If you remember, I split it by a new line character. If you want really complicated ways of splitting things, you want to retrieve data from somewhere. You want to create embeddings and cache them. You want to store your data in a vector store. You want to index it for fast retrieval. LangChain is essentially the glue between all of these pieces. So instead of using 10, 15 different tools, you can use LangChain to combine all of these ideas together. Go to a website, go fetch some data as text. Turn that HTML into plain text. Turn that plain text into an embedding. Store that embedding in a vector store. Read it from a vector store and feed it to an LLM and fine-tune the LLM. Prompt the LLM with the data you want. Start a conversation with the LLM. Remember the history of your conversation with the LLM. All done through this particular tool. Give me an interface for all the interactivity I've had with my LLM. That's what this does. So you might come across LangChain. It's exceptionally common in JavaScript and Python. Python's really where it has most of its functionality, but it does a lot with JavaScript and TypeScript too. This is another tool you will see in the ecosystem. So LangChain is a very, very common one that you will look into. Again, some final thoughts just as we wrap up. A lot of moving parts, a lot of new things here. Please, if there's anything you walk away with, just know your fundamentals first. It's very, very tempting to look at this and be like, now I will build these models and so on. Like, not if you can't work with arrays and objects and functions and async functions and so on. You gotta eat your vegetables first. The other challenging thing is these APIs are always changing. So if I were to give this meetup in 3 months, it probably would be different. If I gave this meetup 3 months ago, the code would look different. The thing that you just want to lead into is, what am I actually doing here? If you can understand conceptually what needs to be done, not only can you look at the documentation, you can also prompt AI to help you. I want to make a prompt that does XYZ. I want to feed this to a vector store. How can I store it in Postgres? How can I store it in XYZ? The conceptual understanding is the really important part. But before you do any of that, you got to know your fundamentals. Last but not least, this, in my opinion, is the future. I was not around to remember a tremendous amount when the internet first came to be. I was, a child. So I don't remember the first time that people saw a browser and were just like, oh, that's the future of everything. But this is definitely it. This is definitely what we will be using either every day in our day-to-day, as a developer, as something adjacent. This is not going to replace every single industry and so on. And hopefully we're not going to destroy ourselves because someone fed some data to an LLM that went haywire. I don't think we're there. But at the same time, it's not going to change everything. Developers are still going to be necessary. Developers are not going anywhere. Developers that know what they're doing are going to be in great shape. Developers that don't know what they're doing and rely on these tools to write all the code are not going to be very successful. So, kind of closing thoughts here. You've seen some kind of cool things and cool ideas and new functionality and putting together pieces and parts. But at the end of the day, the fundamentals are what is going to make you a good developer. It's going to make you a valuable developer. It's going to make you work really well alongside these tools, because they're at no place of replacing all the work that we do if we know how to work with them. So it's my kind of 2 cents on what we're seeing here. We're nearing the end of time. I know, again, we've seen a lot. We'll send a recording to this as well. We'll share some of the code and some of the slide data that we have as well. So if you want to play around with this, check it out and so on, you're more than welcome to. I want to just check and see if there are any last questions before we wrap up here. Question here, what are the considerations for / if when the LLM or API is updated? Will this potentially affect your application beyond making it more accurate? Ideally, with a lot of these updates, you might get some warnings of like, hey, the way that you're using the API is slightly outdated. Hopefully, they're not going to be breaking changes where the thing that you did yesterday now doesn't work. That's pretty unlikely. For your LLM, if there is a new model that comes out, you would need to, train your data on that new model. And it's not terribly difficult to do to kind of port from one to another, because once you get it in the right format and give it the right instructions, they all essentially work in a similar way to how they're accepting data. So there might be some small tweaking between different kinds of models, but the feeding of sort and the training is, once you've got it down with one thing, there's obviously a lot of tweaking to do with other things. Do you happen to know how many question answer cycles does it take to cost, let's say, $1? I don't know. Let's see what is OpenAI. I think it does give me some kind of like pricing for what I've got here. So it gives you a nice little kind of usage. Let's see what charges we racked up. We have spent in this lecture 1 cent. So, you can imagine it will add up eventually. But the good news is with a lot of these questions, you can also cache a lot of those responses. So once the LLM has asked what does includes do, we can, programmatically do that. And there are ways for us to kind of make it a little bit smarter. But it would take a lot for this to cost $1. Definitely would have to be some decent use here. The first example you gave when asking null versus null, and you said, I don't know, and that's accepting the answer. What are some ways that you could solve that issue? So how do I make this quiz application a little bit more rigorous? What I have here is probably not the world's best prompt. And this is where even using tools like LangChain, it can optimize the prompt that you have. Even if the answer is not complete or partially correct, mark it as correct. This right here is one piece that instructs the LLM to be a little forgiving. This right here also instructs the LLM to, not use too much creativity. If I wanted to really tune down the temperature to where there's no chance of hallucination and more of a chance of I don't know, this would probably lean more towards you got to be really, really accurate. Otherwise, the inference is not going to be as strong. So those two things, playing around with the prompt, playing around with the temperature, are probably going to be the things that will allow me to have a little bit more forgiving or a little bit less forgiving. I think if we were really building a better quiz, I probably would have kind of different tiers of answer so that we could be a little bit wiser with that. I think with terms of yes or no, it's a little bit hard to do with things like null or undefined, because I can give you a short answer that's sort of right. So ideally, it might be like partially correct, totally correct. That's where I think you can make this a little more interesting. What are your thoughts on the advancement of AI developers like Devon AI? Do you see a point in the future where tools will make entry-level software engineers obsolete? Why or why not? No, I mean, I think Devon AI is like, it's a cool trick, but I think that, it doesn't do anything that these tools are not doing already, like write unit tests for me and so on. It's also very feasible that many companies could just never use a tool like Devon because of, all sorts of privacy and so on. I think that as you become more knowledgeable and technical, there is going to be less of a need for developers that are not that good. So I think that in order to break into this industry, you're going to have to be a little bit better than you had to be a couple years ago because there are tools that can do the absolute bare minimum. So that being said, it may be a little bit harder, or it may be a little bit different in 5 years when instead of writing JavaScript, we instead write a lot more code that looks like this. So we either write code that is transpiled to a different language, or we're feeding the LLM something different. But I think Devin AI is, it's cute and it raises some money and it's kind of hype, but there's no world in which that thing is doing very complicated stuff that is not slightly fine-tuned.
Can I just add something to that? Yeah, just be cognizant when you're hearing about Devin AI or any other things like that. There's a lot of marketing going on. So just remember who you are listening to, basically, and kind of adjust how much you trust it accordingly.
At the same time, though, you gotta, if you don't know your fundamentals, if you don't know how to really work with JavaScript, and instead you're kind of cobbling together AI stuff, like, yeah, you're gonna be in trouble, no doubt about it. So this stuff is awesome, but gotta know the fundamentals no matter. All right, team, we're a little bit over for time. Thanks so much for joining us. This is the first time we've actually ever done this meetup, so I hope you enjoyed it. We'll definitely, do more of these kind of fun AI pieces as we go through. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend. Hopefully, we'll see you on Zoom real soon. Thanks, everyone.